you like audiobooks or audio shows, check out a free trial of Audible. Just click the link in the description.
Welcome to MINDSHOCK True Crime. You are listening to the Delphi case series. This is episode 11, the FBI, and we will be examining issues with the investigation, but particularly one aspect that a lot of people have trouble with, and that is the role of the FBI in the Delphi case, and what they would and wouldn't do, and what they would and wouldn't investigate, and for what reason, and if there are any overarching variables involving the FBI and the Delphi investigation. As always, if you enjoyed the podcast, you can donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. Make sure you subscribe to the channel. Hit that bell for notifications. Make sure you allow your device to have those notifications come through. If that's still not working, you could just go to youtube.com/MINDSHOCK or youtube.com/MINDSHOCKTrueCrime. To keep up awareness in this case, hit that like button, share this podcast across social media platforms, of which you can find us on Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, and Patreon. Patrons do get priority for case topic, logical analysis, co-podcaster requests. You could also be a guest on the podcast depending on your tier. Questions, comments, theories, thoughts, suggestions, rebuttals, debunkings of any kind, leave them in the comment section. Obviously, a lot of cases are only solved due to tips from the public, and keeping up awareness in cases can not only prevent them from becoming cold, but can get cold cases solved. Awareness and pressure are key. So, let's discuss the role of the FBI. So, just in general, for all the coincidence theorists out there that get heavily triggered, like a 4-year-old throwing a tantrum, anytime any kind of notion of a law enforcement perpetrator or police conspiracy and or cover-up are brought up, because again, their subconscious realizes that it's a legitimate line of inquiry, but their cognitive dissonance prevents them from logically and neutrally examining it. They don't have the mental strength to do so. So they have to pretend it's these crazy conspiracy theorists, aka critical thinkers, capable of deductive reasoning and basic logic and reason, that they're just all crazy and none of these avenues have any validity, where we don't really have any way of knowing whether they do or they don't. And again, for any true crime aficionado that has studied cases where there was police corruption and or cover-ups and or police perpetrators and how they unfolded, how they were kept wrapped up. And that's a key critical factor there, because if you're an officer in a department investigating some kind of crime, gruesome or not, you're not going to automatically think to investigate your fellow officers. That just doesn't happen. And for whatever reason, again, the cognitive dissonant coincidence theorists out there, these goofballs that are hopelessly indoctrinated into the cult of state and authority worship, they can't consider that people wearing costumes can be fallible and or corrupt, but of course they can. So what is the role of the FBI? If the FBI rolls up on the investigation, they're not going to automatically assume a police officer is the perpetrator. That's not how investigations work. There's a certain camaraderie between law enforcement on one hand. On the other hand, there's also competition, because FBI officers and special agents, obviously, they typically think of themselves as more competent than local law enforcement, especially small town law enforcement. But that aside, the FBI doesn't come to a case to specifically investigate law enforcement corruption, although it does happen. You do have internal affairs and all of these things, but in general, the status quo is not for FBI to just start investigating police officers as if they are the guilty parties, or assuming that there's a vast law enforcement conspiracy at play and actively investigating that. It just doesn't happen. That's not how it works. Now, if by accident they uncover it, they might run with it. Now, here are the variables regarding this aspect of the case. If the FBI are involved in a bigger investigation. And people that are familiar with MINDSHOCK might know where I'm going with this, because I've discussed this in the Maura Murray case and the Stephen Avery case. If there's an overarching investigation where they're after some drug kingpin, possibly law enforcement corruption with multiple officers, multiple other murders, they're not going to botch their entire investigation to solve one or two murders. And again, if you think I'm wrong, feel free to point to cases where it has been definitively determined that an investigation was botched for the sole purpose of solving one or two homicides. If there's an investigation of many more homicides, drug trafficking, where there's bigger fish to fry, there's a certain priority order that bureaucracy functions based off of. They're not going to just abandon all these other cases, particularly if they've spent years on another case and there's many, many murders involved, and there's possibly, again, if it's a case of corruption investigation, if there are some high-ranking officials, state officials, government officials, or otherwise, they're not going to just forget about all of them for the sole purpose of closure for a family or local community. Again, if someone can find an instance of this happening where just a large-scale FBI investigation was compromised and or abandoned in order to do that, feel free. I haven't seen one yet. I mean, maybe it has happened, but that's just not really how government functions, and we have all of history to see that. There's certain red flag cases, again, the Maura Murray case, the Stephen Avery case, where there's something going on involving or possibly involving government officials that for whatever reason, a case will just either never be solved because of that, or will only be solved after the fact of a larger investigation already being solved, so then there's no compromising. If the FBI or some government agency, if they solve their case and they get all the guilty parties and there's nothing that needs to be classified any longer, then of course they would release whatever they need to release and solve some of the cases that might have intersected with the bigger case. This is all very obvious and basic, but for whatever reason, again, there's a lot of individuals who they're just allergic to logic. They just can't see how the FBI or any of these larger organizations wouldn't simply compromise a bigger case for a smaller case. It just doesn't happen. That's just not the way that it works. And you can say, fortunately, unfortunately, I mean, all guilty parties need to be accountable for everything, but it's tough in terms of timelines, it's very, very tough to really understand how the FBI or even, let's say it's a local case, if there's intersecting local cases. Now, in a small town, that could be a little bit different, but in a city, if they're going after these bigger criminals and they've invested a certain amount of years and undercover agents in an investigation, and in order to solve a single homicide or a smaller case, they would have to compromise all of that. Are they going to do that? Ask yourself that question logically. They're not going to do that. Now, hopefully they can resolve their bigger case quickly, so that way there's nothing to compromise at that point, and then they can solve all these other cases. And that's, of course, the best case scenario. That way everybody gets justice. But the problem is, of course, that does take time. That's not something that happens super quickly. So between the points of just the FBI not immediately going to investigate law enforcement corruption, or they're already investigating some kind of corruption, higher up corruption, and they don't want to blow or compromise that. So that way all they can really do, but they would have a vested interest in the case, and they would make sure law enforcement didn't release too much to compromise a different case, would they not? If there are certain persons of interest that overlap to the bigger cases, if releasing more information, more evidence, more of the audio, whatever the case may be, if that compromises the bigger cases, they wouldn't allow Delphi to do that, would they? And these are all things that need to be considered, because all of this supposed law enforcement incompetence, and there could be some of that too. Let's not fall for false dichotomies or these black and white logical fallacies. There could be a fair share of incompetent law enforcement officers investigating this Delphi case, but there could also be direct orders from higher agencies due to action in other cases that they cannot compromise. They've sort of really tied the hands of Delphi law enforcement, possibly state police. They've tied the hands of these other law enforcement agencies in order to not compromise the higher level investigation. Does that explain what we're seeing in the Delphi case? It would appear to explain a lot of issues in these other cases. Is the Delphi case one of them? Now, to those clueless coincidence theorists who cannot employ critical thinking, they're not going to be able to grasp that. But this isn't really the appeal to incredulity. Logical fallacies, of course, become forthcoming whenever a theory like this is presented. But we have known family members and associates of these family members that were involved in drugs, were arrested, do run in criminal circles. So there's a clear criminal element. Circling these two girls. Now, there is a theory that this was some kind of retaliation killing and one or both of the girls were targeted. But whether that's true or not, the possibility that there's some overlap with family members that could possibly be part of a larger case involving drugs, drug trafficking, possible corrupt law enforcement, if the FBI is already investigating that, are they really going to give up their suspect, especially if they know who did it? Let's say they know who did it, but they want to get them for involvement in other things and they already have their eyes on them, or they're already in prison. That could be a possibility as well. So if the FBI truly believes there's no danger to the public because not only do they know the individual or individuals, but they're either already in custody or they're being watched and surveilled in order to catch bigger fish. So it's not a case of somebody being on the loose, so to speak. If they have surveillance set up, if they have undercover agents in the midst. Again, I'm not saying any of this is true, but MINDSHOCK, of course, the motto is the only thing we know for sure is that we don't know anything for sure. So if there is some type of variable, such as this one, that accounts for all these things, does it make sense to how the case was handled from day one? Important questions. Even from the sketches. Is there a reason they didn't want the younger guy's sketch to be released, the young sketch to be released first, even though it was made first? Is it because they really knew he was the guilty party and they were following him to get other individuals? They wanted bigger fish and there was some kind of law enforcement corruption at play? And then the older bridge guy sketch, they allowed Delphi police to release it, possibly using them as useful idiots. They might not have even told them necessarily the real truth. So they might not even be operating with all of the information. And now to make matters worse, of course, because there's so many unknown variables, if a member of Delphi law enforcement was actually the responsible party and FBI don't know that, then this becomes a big, convoluted mess. And does that explain the situation even better? Maybe, maybe not. And accomplices, of course, there could have been accomplices. There could have been multiple perpetrators. Now, let's say there's multiple perpetrators. Let's say one of them has something to do with this bigger case the FBI might be investigating, possibly involving state official corruptions, judges. Of course, we do have a history of judges being involved in corruption and illegal activities in that area. I'll be getting into that as well in a dedicated podcast. This one was just about why everything looks the way that it looks, and can at least a certain portion of what appears to be Delphi law enforcement incompetence possibly be simply following the orders of an upper agency like the FBI? All the MindShock listeners out there, feel free to give your own thoughts, opinions, theories, rebuttals, debunkings of any kind in the comment section. As always, if you enjoyed the podcast, you can donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit that bell for notifications. Like and share this podcast. Keep the awareness up. Keep talking about the case. Keep the case in the public eye so that the pressure will be maintained here, so that local law enforcement, state law enforcement, and the FBI know that nobody has forgotten about this case, and everyone is still waiting for justice. And if this is a result of some bigger case, bigger operation, it does seem like the FBI would never come out and say that, because that's compromising it as well. So I don't want to say necessarily it's understandable, but it would make sense. The response would make more sense if this was the truth. This is Bruce McGuire signing off. Catch you guys next time.